Hi and welcome to Secret Wargamer channel. I'm currently enjoying a playthrough of a game called Moscow 41. It's by an Italian game company called Vento Nuovo Games and was designed by Emanuele Sant'Andrea. Apologies for my poor pronunciation. As you can see, it's a block game and it essentially covers the German drive from Moscow on Moscow from Smolensk. So it covers a period July 41 through to the end of December. I'm well into this game. This is actually game turned for October, and on this occasion actually the Germans are going to win. I can't really see any way for the Soviets to come out, so I'm about to finish it, but I thought it would be a good opportunity just to talk to you a little bit about this game. And it's a game I very much enjoy. It's got lots of replay value, and the game is made to really high quality. So aside from the campaign game, say that lasts from July, so just after Smolensk has fallen, through to December, there are three other scenarios. One's pretty short, just covers July, and that's called Beyond the Dnieper. And the Germans are kind of tasked with capturing these two cities, which actually in game terms, if the Germans have captured those and hold them at the end of a turn, then actually they capture Kiev. Now the map doesn't go as far as Kiev, it's kind of stylized. They also, I think there's some other options for winning the scenario, which is to have a defensive line in each of these two areas. The second one is Operation Typhoon, so that's October through to end of December, unless the Germans win before that, and that recreates the sort of historic campaign where the Germans throw their might of Army Group Centre into a last push against Moscow, and of course we all know what happened there. The third one is really building on Typhoon. It's called the Wehrmacht's Last Gasp, and covers from November to the end of December, so a bit of a blitzkrieg going on, if you pardon the expression. As you can see, the map is divided up into areas. There's a few hundred of them. We also have this road to Leningrad at the side here, which it's Hoff, isn't it? Hopner, rather, kind of slowly makes his way up towards Leningrad. In my particular game, he actually captured it. So it's kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Obviously Leningrad is way off ball. There is a separate game on Leningrad 41, so it's kind of just represented how Hopner is progressing. Okay, so the game I mentioned is very high quality. I think the production values are great. Just taking these blocks, they're very well made, they're beautifully painted. And the stickers actually stick quite well, which can make a change from other, well, I haven't got that many block games, but I have had, I think my Guns of Gettysburg, the stickers started peeling and the blocks started fading. The map, I think, has a very fresh kind of contemporary feel to it. As you can see, areas. It has coloured discs that essentially represent the kind of terrain in the area. So a green disc, that represents something that's pretty open. I think the rules say easy to attack, hard to defend, costs 1 movement point to enter, and both sides can put up to 4 blocks each into that type of area. A yellow area, much more foresty or difficult terrain, 2 movement points to enter, and the maximum number of blocks would be 2 per side. Okay, so you can have 4 blocks in there. Now you've got some other bits and pieces. You've got these defensive lines, and you can build those by reducing the strength of a block during certain turns, or rather I should say certain impulses, and they give you what they call an absorb bonus. So I think this is common practice in block war games. I don't own many, so yeah, maybe it's unique to this one, but I think it's fairly common in that the hits, well, you basically roll dice based on the strength of your unit, right? And depending on what the roll is, you'll get a hit on your opponent, and that will reduce their strength. Well, the absorb bonus, so if you're in a yellow area, he says, there's thousands of them, I can't find one. If you're in a yellow area, then the first hit, or one of the hits, would be absorbed by the terrain. It wouldn't affect the defender's units. Similarly, if you had a defensive line, then the defensive line would also absorb a hit. So in order to inflict any damage on your opponent, you've got to score three hits, which isn't always easy. Okay, also to point out, cities, they add absorb bonuses, so defenders in green areas with a city will get some advantage. Cities are quite stylised. They're like these little white cubes that they're represented by, or squares I should say. Initially I wasn't sure whether I liked that, but I think it adds to the sort of contemporary modern feel that comes across with how this game's been produced. So actually I've grown to like it. What else is there to show you? Victory areas. So they're denoted by these big stars. There's 7 in all, and the Germans have done remarkably well in this game. They've actually got enough to get a marginal victory. And the flags denote who owns the victory area. So the poor old Russians, I'm afraid I've let them down badly. They're defending Moscow and Tula, and everything else has fallen to the Germans. Blocks essentially come in a couple of types, really. We think of them as being fast blocks, and those generally have a darker background, or slow blocks. So here, these have got a fairly light background, they're a slow block, and that really affects their movement, as you would expect. So these guys can move 5 movement points, these guys can only move 3. Similarly, the German Luftwaffe HQ are slow blocks, so they kind of ponderously make their way up the map, whereas other army HQs for German army are fast blocks, so they can scoot around the map pretty quickly. The Russians, their blocks are pretty much all slow. Their HQs are pretty much all slow blocks. So I was slightly distracted there. The Russian HQs are predominantly slow blocks, except for Zhukov. When you draw him, he is a fast block and has many of the attributes that are standard on a German HQ. Now these HQ units are absolutely critical to gameplay. By activating an HQ, it can command units within its own army colouring. So here you've got Guderian, so he can command any of these red coloured units. Can also command any of these sort of white, you can't see it, they're white units. They're not assigned to any particular army, okay? So he can command his red units, any white units that are within range, his command range, and also if he's activated within an area, can actually command any blocks that are already within that area. And that's really important, right? Because every time you use one of these HQs, it loses strength, and that means its command range and strength reduces. So in the end, it can't really do anything. So you've got to be very careful with how you use these things. Now they can fight like a normal unit, or I generally use them to add artillery support to a battle. Luftwaffe units here can provide air support, which I've managed to decimate here, to a battle. And there's another group here. I tend to use the discs. My version did come with these rather nice little sort of metal planes, but they're I start putting them in the areas, and they're just simply too big, but they are a nice touch, and I will get round to painting them. So the point I'm sort of struggling to make is your HQs are really almost like a heartbeat within the game, okay, and they will drive a lot of what you do. The Russians really are hamstrung. Their HQs are quite weak. I think Zhukov starts off as a replacement or reinforcement. So whenever he turns up, is really down to the luck of what you pull out of your draw bag for your random reinforcements. So earlier I mentioned that this is an area impulse game. So there's lots of those about, and so I would imagine people will be relatively familiar. What it means really is that you have a turn, and within that there can be, certainly in this game, almost an indefinite number of sub-turns known as impulses, and you can do various things in those impulses. So generally speaking, you'll have a logistics phase or impulse, usually played at the start of the first turn of the month, except for the campaign game. It might also be an exception for one or two of the scenarios. So in that logistics phase, you can either regenerate your leader back to full strength, and that's important because the leader contributes greatly to something called your logistics value, which I'll talk about in a moment. Where am I? Logistics, yeah. You can regenerate your HQ, so I'll talk about logistics value now. You calculate a value by, well, what's the strength of my leader? How many victory hexes or victory areas do I control? And how many non-exhausted HQs do I have on the board? And that will give you a number, okay? That number is used to calculate how many strength points you can replace in your army, and it's used to calculate how many reinforcements you can draw from your draw bag, and how many what else was it? Reinforcements, strength points, and regenerating your HQs. So very important. And of course, if you've got an exhausted leader, you've got loads of exhausted HQs, and you haven't got many victory points, you're not going to have a very big logistics value. Okay. So important to note, if you, in your logistics phase, you choose to regenerate your leader, you can't then go on to calculate a new logistics value and call for reinforcements or whatever. You do one or the other. There's also something called a strategic impulse. Now, you can only select that if you have the initiative, and to do so you will play the initiative disc by putting it on the map. The strategic impulse can allow you to move and build, move units and or build defensive lines. You can call for reinforcements. Again, they're drawn randomly from your draw bag up to the value of a newly calculated logistics value. Or you can call a tactical impulse, which is probably one of the most important things in the game, I think, which is where you activate your HQs, you move the relevant army units, you have combat, and those are the sort of core parts of your kind of campaign, really, is getting your balance right as to when do I play that initiative disc, because when you play it, it then goes across, if the German plays it, then goes across to the Russians, and the Russians might say, right, I can get a really good logistics value here. I'm going to get myself a dozen new blocks out of the draw bag, and suddenly a weak Russian position becomes quite a stronghold. Okay. I don't want to go into all the minutiae of what happens, but during the other type of impulse to mention is the pass, right? So a player can choose to pass, in which case they can, I think, move one block or build a defensive line. They can't initiate any new battles. If there are 2 consecutive passes, then the turn is over and you go through an end of turn phase and whatnot, and then the whole thing starts again. So you have to be careful, I find that generally now, I've played the game about 4 or 5 times. As the German, I will refrain from using that strategic impulse and spending that disc for as long as I possibly can. Generally, I look for cheap breakthroughs, sort of in this area, using Guderian's Panzers and maybe some of the Second Army to capture the 2 cities I mentioned earlier, which if you hold them at the end of the turn, Kiev falls. So you might be able to get Kiev quite quickly, usually within a couple of turns. And then kind of keep looking for, I look for breakthrough moves. So I'm using as few HQs as I can and making as much ground as I can, seeing what I can do, encirclements and whatnot. That way you can keep reducing Russian strength and create gaps and whatnot, so that they're not given a chance to rebuild. The Russians, on the other hand, I think it's sort of a passive-aggressive approach I tend to take. Sometimes a couple of times I've tried to go for a quick counter-attack. If I've got random, these units, or if they're strong enough, because they're randomly placed at the beginning of the game. If I've got some strong units, I will often try and go for a drive on Smolensk. But you need to know when to stop, because it is extremely easy for the Germans to break through and cut off significant numbers of troops in this area. There's nothing really that stops them. So caution with the Russians, I think. Bit of aggression, but also be prepared to drop back. That's good talking from me, because in this game I've actually managed to get this Russian army here surrounded, and well, you can see the surrendered Russian units here from previous turns. So without getting into all of the rules and whys and wherefores of how things happen, and just thinking back to what I thought I'd want this channel to cover when I first set it up, and it really was around my own experiences with games. So based on my own experience and based on, I don't know, 4, 5, maybe 6 playthroughs, my feelings are that this is a very replayable game. There's lots of sort of random draws that happen in these draw bags, so your setup is never the same twice, your reinforcement schedule is never the same twice. You have a little bit of luck with how the die rolls work, but it takes a bit of effort to figure out how best to command each side. The Germans, quick breakthroughs, blitzing around, and the Russians really are trying to keep things intact and wait for that weather to turn, because when the weather turns, things really start moving in your favour. I particularly like the production values. I like how the map has been presented. I like the quality of the pieces. The rule book is pretty easy to understand and well illustrated. There's some historical notes, a bit biased there because I know my brother contributed to those. But I really do find this an enjoyable game. I've not played Leningrad 41 very much. I'm just getting, well, I'm going to set that up probably next. Same engine, but there's very different approach as the terrain is pretty hard to get through. And I'm looking forward to Kiev 41 coming out. I'm not always a great one for series of games. The one series that I have enjoyed is No Retreat, and I'll be honest, I'm enjoying this just as much. I think as I'm getting older, I like perhaps simpler, quicker games, ones that I'm not going to have set up for months on end. So this right now fits my gaming requirements very nicely. And if you get it, I doubt very much you'll be disappointed. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Thank you for watching.